Welcome to today's Interspecies Conversations lecture. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Kate Armstrong and I'm Head of Program for the Interspecies Internet. It's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the trustees and the organisation. So this series of conversations is a regular online lecture and workshop series that gives the opportunity to invite professors, scientists, researchers and students to present and share their work that contributes to advancing the acceleration and understanding of the diversity, forms and functions of communication in other species. So we aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussions where our community can join the conversation with ideas and feedback. Today we'll hear a 50-minute presentation and an ensuing Q&A. So today's speakers are Josephine Hubbard and Lisa Walker. And this lecture is entitled Conversing with Whales, Humpbacks as a Model for Interstellar Communication. Humpback whales are majestic animals immersed in a watery world. Complexity is a pervasive component of these animals' lives, from their fluid social structures and long-distance migration patterns to their coordinated feeding behaviours and intricate vocal communication. This talk will discuss what characteristics humpbacks possess that make them a great model for understanding interspecies communication. Our speakers are Josephine Hubbard and Lisa Walker. They're researchers in the SETI-Templeton Humpback Whale Research team, and I know some of their colleagues are joining us today. This is an interdisciplinary team of biologists, musicians, artists, and physicists who seek to understand the communicative complexity, intelligence, and flexibility of humpback whales. So Josie Hubbard is a graduate student at the Animal Behavior Graduate Group at the University of California, Davis. Her research explores the interaction between behavioral flexibility and cognition with an animal's propensity to adjust to anthropogenic disturbances and engage in human-wildlife interactions. Lisa Walker is a whale song theorist. She takes her background in music and applies it to understanding the song of the humpback whale. Her studies are informed by traditional field research, artificial intelligence, information theory, and immersive underwater observations of singing whales. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Lisa and Josie.
Great, thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. I think I can speak for both Lisa and I that we're both really excited to be here today to be a part of this discussion and also to be invited to speak on behalf of our group. We're excited to share some of our recent findings with you regarding humpback whale communication. And although we have a couple of different projects that are going on within our group currently, this talk is going to focus on a particular element, that of conversing with, or rather instigating a dynamic communicative exchange with humpback whales, and essentially what these types of exchanges might mean for detecting intelligence signals in the universe. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so just to start off, I wanted to give us a roadmap for where we're going to be headed in this talk. So first, I'll introduce our team really briefly and our goals. Then I'll describe some of the broader goals of SETI and the characteristics of humpback whales. And then I'll link some of those characteristics of the whales to some proposed prerequisites for an interspecies conversation. At that point, we'll introduce our humpback whale framework for interspecies communication and provide some examples on how we think humpbacks might elicit some of these aforementioned prereqs. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some broader conclusions and future directions. So here's our team. We are the Whale SETI, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Research Group. As Kate mentioned, we're interdisciplinary with diverse backgrounds from biology and physics to art and music. But we've all come together with this joint goal to better understand this complexity of humpback whale signals and their potential to provide a model for detecting intelligence in the universe. And so this collaboration is kind of a culmination across 3 major institutes, including the SETI Institute, the Alaska Whale Foundation, and the University of California, Davis. But before we get into the biology of humpback whales and their characteristics, I first just wanted to describe some of the work that the SETI Institute does to detect interstellar life, to kind of contextualize our group goals. And probably the quickest and most direct way to do that is by introducing the Drake equation. So this was an equation that was presented by Frank Drake as the agenda for the first SETI meeting or conference in 1961. And this equation defines the number of intelligent civilizations in the galaxy, which is represented on the left side as the variable n. And this n is a product of 7 factors. So if we move from the left side to the right in the equation, these factors can include several physical properties, such as R, or the rate of star formation, as well as the fraction of stars that might have planetary systems. But it also can consider several biological factors, such as the number of habitable planets per solar system, and the fraction of habitable planets that might host life, the fraction of that life that might be intelligent, as well as the fraction of life that develops technology to then communicate its existence in the universe. And then last but not least, we have L, or the average length of time that civilizations are detectable. And lots of the work from the SETI organization is focused more on the left side of these factors, such as physical factors or the fraction of habitable planets. But less has been done to explore what fraction of life is intelligent. And that's where our group goals kind of coalesce with the SETI mission under this factor of F sub I. So we're interested in developing a type of intelligence filter as determined by the structures of these signals using non-human intelligences as a model. And there are many different ways that we can define intelligence. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of them here, but just as much to say that our group plans to focus on one specific type, that of communication intelligence. So humpback whales produce a high diversity and complexity of sounds, from their intricate song displays on the breeding grounds to the dozens of social sounds that they use both on and off the feeding grounds. And so just to give you an idea of what some of these signals might sound like, I'll play a clip for you of a humpback whale song. And while you listen, note the variation in the sounds that are produced. So given that high level of variation and complexity in these systems, we can use them as a model to quantify the structure of these signals as a proxy for communication intelligence. And one way that we can do that is with mathematical tools such as information theory. And so information theory is essentially the mathematical representation of both the conditions and parameters that affect the transmission and then subsequent processing of information. And these ideas started were kind of originated in the 20th century with the creation of human communication systems, such as telegraph lines. And scientists such as Claude Shannon were focused on improving these systems to transmit signals effectively. And so Shannon was the one to first introduce this concept of information theory and asserted that the size of the signal was not necessarily tied to the amount of information it contained. Instead, what he did was propose measurements like calculations of entropy to measure the structure of these signals in order to quantify their information content, despite the fact that they might need to travel through a noisy environment. So these are some of the theories that our group draws upon to tackle questions like how much information might be transmitted in humpback whale signals, and how might humpback whale signal structure inform detecting intelligent signals in the universe. So now that I've given you some background on our group goals in relation to SETI, now I'd like to take some time to introduce our study species, the humpback whale. First, the humpback whales can be found all over the world and in all of the major oceans. They're also long-lived, with an average lifespan of anywhere from 40 to up to 100 years. And long-lived species like this can be selected for complex learning behaviors that might increase their survival ability throughout their lifetime. So this might culminate in complex behaviors such as bubble net feeding, which require individuals to come together to produce bubbles in a formation that allows them to effectively corral schools of prey. And these tasks are really considered complex because they often require task allocation among individuals and even role fidelity across bubble net feeding events. Another trait is that humpbacks are often described as living almost like a tale of two lives because they engage in this long distance annual migration from their breeding grounds in warmer waters to their feeding grounds in cooler waters. And so, for example, the population that we study migrates thousands of miles from their feeding grounds in Southeast Alaska to their breeding grounds in Hawaii and Mexico. And lastly, humpbacks have this fluid and dynamic social structure, where the majority of their time is spent traveling in small groups, but these small groups can come together into larger aggregations, especially during breeding season, where individuals are searching for mating partners, as well as during the feeding season when there's large aggregations of prey. Okay, but you might be wondering, how do humpbacks fit these SETI goals, and what might make them a good model for what we're trying to do? Well, first of all, humpbacks live in this three-dimensional watery world where visibility is relatively poor compared to terrestrial animals that rely heavily on visual cues. So instead, humpbacks and arguably other marine mammals are likely to rely on acoustic cues to receive information about their environment and their conspecifics. And this watery medium allows for the transmission of particularly low frequency signals over really long distances. And humpbacks have evolved in this system and are able to use this medium to transmit signals to their conspecifics far away. So for example, humpback whale calls have been shown to be detected up to 100 kilometers from a sound source and maybe even more, and still have the ability to be classified into call types by algorithms informed by humpback whale sensory capabilities. And finally, as I've already kind of touched on briefly, humpback whales have highly complex and structured calls with many individual elements. And this structure may allow for the efficient packaging of information to travel these long distances and endure sufficient time lags before reaching another individual. And so all these traits together might provide insights into our own search for extraterrestrial intelligence in the universe, where signals are likely to contain structure or complexity to transmit information, as well as experience these long time lags during transmission. So more broadly, when I think of interspecies communication, it first brings to mind interactions between humans and non-human intelligent beings like animals. So here I've just picked out a couple of examples of species whom seem to show evidence of crossing this communication boundary, either in terms of acoustic or gestural communication. So from having acoustic exchanges with parrots to sign language with chimpanzees, or even talking with, on keyboards with dolphins, there are lots of different ways that we can have conversations with non-human animals or beings. But most of all, the examples I think of are the ones that are most close to home. So these interactions that I might have with my cat or dog, as well as the interactions that I honestly try not to have with my study species when I'm studying animal behavior. And some months ago, Natalie Uamini presented to this group a set of potential prerequisites for interspecies communication. And so I'd like to revisit some of those prereqs because I found them profoundly useful as I was preparing for this talk, because I was kind of actively thinking about whether humpback whales might have the potential to possess any or all of these traits. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these, mostly because we have exciting results to present and an exciting discussion for after, but I'll just list them here briefly. So the first requirement is the desire to communicate, or a motivation for both interactants to engage in a conversation. The next is that of turn taking between interactants and active listening. The third is to have a shared understanding or shared goal between interactants. The fourth is that each interactant must have compatible sensory systems, otherwise signals might not be perceived by the receiver. And lastly, each interactant might need matching or at least similar intelligence types, because again, signals might otherwise not be perceived or even decoded by the receiver. And so for this talk, we're going to highlight these first two requirements of desire to communicate and aspects of turn taking. And to do this, I'd like to introduce our humpback whale framework for interspecies communication. So using this framework, we'll provide some examples and supporting evidence from our own work with humpbacks to illustrate these points. So the first one we'll talk about is desire to communicate. And I think it's even arguable that this might even precede the prerequisites, because without it, you might not be able to engage in other prereqs like turn taking. So in that section, we're going to go over some examples of humpback whales who seemingly show a desire to communicate with humans through curiosity and friendliness behavior. Next, we'll emphasize the utility and importance of using interactive playback experiments in the pursuit of understanding animal communication systems. Just really briefly, to describe playbacks, playback experiments are often defined by either their passive or interactive nature, where passive playbacks broadcast stimuli at specified random intervals, whereas interactive playbacks adjust the broadcasted stimuli based on the animal's reaction in real time. And so these interactive playback experiments can provide a target species or individual with an opportunity to engage in turn taking if they're willing. And there are many different forms of turn taking, which is just the alternating of information or exchange between interactants. But this might be important for a conversation because this could prevent the overlap or interruption of signals. And so turn taking is pervasive in the animal communication literature, but in fact, aspects of vocal synchrony during vocal exchanges, like for example, matching a specific signal type or shortening the length of time between signals, have been shown to correlate with changes in behavior, such as arousal, valence, or might even provide evidence of engagement between interactants. So measuring these aspects of vocal exchanges during turn taking, such as the intercall interval or the amount of time between calls, as well as the amount of temporal matching between participants, might provide us with indications of when non-human intelligences are engaged in a communicative exchange, as opposed to maybe signaling on their own repetitively via a duty cycle. And so to illustrate the first trait, the desire to communicate, I'm going to share with you 3 examples of humpback whales who spontaneously engage in interactions with people through curiosity and friendliness behaviors. And so the first of those behaviors is what we call mugging. Mugging occurs when whales voluntarily approach boats at close distances, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, but they remain in close proximity for a certain amount of time, which can be upwards of an hour. And during this time, the boats don't really have the opportunity to disengage or leave the interaction without risk of injuring the whales. And so it's really up to the whales to kind of decide when this interaction is over and move away. And what's really interesting, I think, about this behavior and the other 2 that I'll show you next is that they don't seem to be food motivated. So what I mean is that they don't coincide with other behaviors regarding feeding, like provisioning from people, or other indications like deep diving or lunging for prey items, which is common for humpbacks. And so here's a video outlining an example of mugging. And sometimes when whales engage in these mugging behaviors, they can also show other behaviors like spy hopping or producing bubble rings. So here's an example of spy hopping, where whales will actually lift themselves vertically out of the water column, at least beyond their eye level, to seemingly inspect objects on the surface of the water, such as maybe whale watching boats with humans on them. And as I just mentioned, also during these muggings, these whales can produce what we might consider friendly bubble rings. And the reason why we might consider them friendly is because they seem to occur in the absence of feeding or aggression. And so here's a video example of 3 different events where humpback whales produce bubble rings in close proximity to whale watching boats.
He's blowing bubbles! He's here.
Whoa, whoa! Wow, very cool.
Apparently there's another whale off the other side as well. Here comes another one. I've never seen him
So one of the things that our research group is currently doing is trying to understand the context in which these bubble rings are produced by humpbacks. And we encourage folks that might have documented instances of these behaviors to contribute those observations to our broader study on bubble ring production. So now that I've presented some behaviors that indicate examples of a humpback whale's willingness to communicate across this interspecies boundary, I kind of want to take that step one step further and talk about the utility of interactive playback experiments in not just illustrating an animal's ability or interest in communicating, but also other aspects of engagement like turn taking or temporal matching. So for now, I'd like to take the audience to Southeast Alaska, where in the summer of 2021, our research team went out on a vessel to conduct playback experiments with humpback whales in the breeding grounds. And humpback whales have been shown to elicit a variety of calls, up to 40 different types of calls. But many of these calls have relatively unknown function on the feeding grounds. And so work from Michelle Fournette and others have shown that some of these social calls can show stability across decades and even populations, compared to their songs on the breeding grounds that are constantly incorporating new elements and evolving. So one such social sound is the whoop or the thrup call. And this call is ubiquitous across populations, and it's thought to function potentially as a contact call. And so just to give you an idea of what a whoop sounds like, I'll play this short clip for you. And what's kind of characteristic of this sound is the beginning low frequency growl period, followed by this higher frequency upsweep element. So that's the whoop. So what our goals were for this field season were to try to better understand the function of these whoop calls by measuring both the acoustic and behavioral responses of humpbacks when these calls were broadcasted during playback experiments. And what our expectations were is that if a whoop call does function as a contact call, then we might expect the whales to either physically approach the vessel or produce an acoustic response to a whoop playback stimuli to potentially provide information to their group mates about their location, status, or even identity. And so to perform these playbacks, we had our team distributed between the top deck, where we collected behavioral observations of whales, and the lower deck, where we managed our equipment for playbacks. But what's important is that throughout all phases of the experiment, both teams were blind to each other. And in addition to collecting behavioral information on the whales, the top deck crew also used fluke ID photos to identify individual whales by comparing photos of their tails or their flukes to a long-term database maintained by organizations such as Happy Whale, the Alaska Whale Foundation, and the University of Alaska Southeast. And so these fluke IDs act as almost like a sort of a fingerprint for whales that's unique to individuals, which allows us to track them through space and time. And so in between experiments, when we were out during this season, we would record sounds passively to help develop a diverse pool of exemplars for broadcasting in the playbacks. And so on August 18th, during one of these passive recordings, we extracted a high quality whoop call from a group of 9 whales, which we, for the rest of the talk, will refer to as day 1. This was only one of 6 whoop calls produced during this 90-minute passive recording period. And so on this graphic, the whoop calls are represented by the numbers on the spectrogram. And here I'm just showing a zoomed in portion of the beginning of that recording to kind of show you where the whoops were occurring. And so we took this whoop exemplar, extracted it, and then used it during a playback trial on the following day, August 19th. And then we refer to this throughout the rest of the presentation as day 2. So all of our experiments had 3 different phases: a pre-period, a playback or experimental period, and then a post period that were each 20 minutes long. And the pre and post periods really just act as a control for the playback period where we broadcasted this exemplar. And throughout the duration of the entire experiment, there were a total of 5 whales present throughout all of these phases on day 2. So when we started the playback phase of the experiment on day 2, it started as a passive playback where we were broadcasting this exemplar at essentially random intervals. But only after 3 iterations of broadcasting the exemplar, one of the whales that was close to our vessel, who was later identified via fluke ID as a 35-year-old female named Twain, she started to begin an extensive and dynamic communicative exchange with our playback stimuli. So at that point, our passive playback really turned into an interactive playback, where we began to spontaneously vary the amount of time the exemplar stimuli was played back in response to this whale's communication patterns. So this whale, Twain, was the only whale in close proximity of the boat for the entire duration of that playback period and remained there for the entirety of that phase. Additionally, she was the only whale who was present on both days, day 1 and day 2, which might suggest that her acoustic responses or engagement in this interaction might either be a reflection of an acoustic mirroring effect. So what I mean by that is maybe she's responding to a whoop call of herself that was recorded on the previous day, or it's also possible that she might be just responding to a familiar stimuli or essentially a call of a familiar group mate from someone who she was traveling with on the previous day. So to give you an idea of what this exchange sounded like, I'll play for you both the example of our playback stimuli or our exemplar, and then Twain's response. So here is the exemplar, which is a whoop call. And then here's Twain's response. And for further explanation of the exchange event and how we define countercalling, I'll hand it over to Lisa.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josie. So on this slide is a visual overview of the 20-minute dynamic interactive playback timeline. And my aim is to explain the interaction, including how we defined phases based on behavioral observations, including Twain's blow characteristics and her orientation to and distance from our vessel. So Josie has introduced 3 main phases of the playback, including pre, during, and post. What I'm going to describe are 3 specific phases we identified within the actual playback or experimental phase. These include phase 1 engagement, phase 2 agitation, and phase 3, the disengagement phase. So to better explain the timeline, the green boxes represent the exemplars, the whoop call recorded on day 1 that we rebroadcast on day 2. Each exemplar is numbered. For instance, E4 represents the 4th exemplar we broadcast. Twain's responses are captured in the blue boxes. Again, each blue box is numbered. For instance, T2 is Twain's 2nd response. Time to next event represents the time duration between the previous event and the current event. For instance, E4 took place 11 seconds after Twain's 1st response. Twain's 2nd response took place 6 seconds after the 4th exemplar, and so on. The full timeline covers all 38 exemplars issued and all 36 of Twain's responses. We observed 7 blows over the course of the playback. Blows are annotated in gray, and the small number below is the time after the previous event that the blow occurred. In this case, Twain surfaced and blew 18 seconds after exemplar 19 was issued. We use these blows and their characteristics to help define the phases of the playback and classify Twain's assumed motivational state. Characteristics of the blow, such as the amplitude or force of the blow, may suggest arousal, valence, or a combination of both, with arousal measuring the intensity of an emotional state and valence measuring whether it's positive or negative. Thus, we classified blows into 2 types: neutral blows, those with no distinguishing features, and wheezy blows. These types of blows are considered to indicate excitement and agitation in humpback whales. So this graphic details Twain's various locations and orientations over the course of the playback vis-a-vis the vessel, as well as blow classification. The hydrophones are deployed at the bow, 1 on each side, and the broadcast speaker is on the port hand side of the bow. In terms of timeline, it's important to note that the first observation of Twain is when she head lunged toward the direction of the boat before the playback had started. As such, Twain was already close to the boat by the time the playback period began, as evidenced by blow 1, which took place after exemplar 1, and blow 2, which took place after exemplar 2. Blow 1 and blow 2 are considered neutral. So exemplar 1 marks the beginning of the engagement phase, which continues to blow 3, which marks the start of the agitation phase. The blows in this phase are classified as wheezy, with blows number 3 and 4 distinctly audible both above and below water. Blow number 5 is also classified as wheezy, but we did not detect it audibly on our hydrophone. Phase 3, disengagement, contains blow number 6 and blow number 7, which are classified as neutral. This phase includes Twain's final vocalizations. And other than these sightings, we do not know the position of Twain with respect to the vessel. The water was calm but murky, and we did not deploy any underwater cameras. It's interesting to note, though, that 4 out of the 7 surfacings took place on the port hand side of the vessel, near to the speaker, and that Twain was already physically departing the vessel before we had finished broadcasting the exemplars. So to give you a better idea of Twain's blows and their characteristics, this video shows blow number 2, which we labeled as neutral, versus blow number 3 and 4, the wheezy blows we detected both above and below the water.
Ooh. So that's there we go.
Well,
Fluke. So it was a
So based on Twain's blow characteristics and surface behavior, we defined 3 specific phases within the playback as follows. Phase 1 engagement takes place between the first exemplar and ends before blow number 3. Phase 2 agitation contains wheezy blows number 3 through number 5 and ends before blow number 6. Phase 3 disengagement contains blows 6 and 7, the final exemplar we broadcast, and Twain's final 3 whoops as she continues to call after the playback period has ended. And it's curious to note that these final whoops are evenly spaced at 41 seconds, 40 seconds, and 40 seconds. To analyze the data, we used the concept of counter-calling pairs to help us define what we considered an interaction event. Here we defined a counter-calling pair as an exemplar followed by a response by Twain, and we used the temporal measurement of these pairs to determine interest or disinterest. The example here is of exemplar number 4, which was issued 11 seconds after Twain's first response. Twain then vocalizes her second response 6 seconds after we issued exemplar number 4. The total number of exemplars followed by Twain responding in counter-calling pairs in the 20-minute playback was 28. 14 of these were in the phase 1 engagement, 13 in phase 2 agitation, and only 1 pair in phase 3, the disengagement phase. Events that were removed from our calculations included synchronous events. And this is where Twain's responses overlapped with the playback of our exemplars. We also removed events where we issued 2 exemplars in a row. That is, Twain did not vocalize between these 2 events. And we removed events where Twain vocalized 2 or more times in a row without us issuing any exemplar. And now I'm going to hand it back to Josie for further analysis.
Great. So to test the idea that this might have been an interactive or dynamic acoustic exchange during the playback period, Twain's whoop calls on day 2, as well as a series of whoop calls that were recorded on day 1, were acoustically analyzed for both spectral and temporal features. And due to the limitations of just using a single whoop exemplar that could only be manipulated via the timing of broadcast, we chose to limit our analysis to a single variable of interest, the intercall interval. And the intercall interval is just the latency of time between calls, or the time difference between the end of a previous call and the start of the next call. And so one rationale for choosing this metric is that it might represent 2 fundamental aspects of emotional content of calls, which we've already essentially introduced, both arousal and valence. And these could be used to evaluate the motivational state of Twain and thus the interactive nature of this exchange. So for these data, we only analyze the latency between Twain's responses, not the time between our exemplar and Twain. And we did this because we wanted to measure whether Twain was adjusting her timing or the amount of time between her responses during the playback compared to a day when whoop calls were produced in the absence of an experiment. So to first orient you to this results figure, we've plotted the entire playback period from day 2 on the x-axis with each one of our phases that Lisa nicely described. And then we have the latency between Twain's calls on the y-axis in seconds. And the amount of, or the, I guess the amount or the number of seconds in the latency is represented by these bars. And so the only difference between the red and the blue bars is that the red bars were directly following a surface blow. And so we removed them from our countercall analysis simply because it takes time for the whale to come to the surface. And this might have affected her ability to engage in countercalling with the exemplar in those instances. And then the blue bars, on the other hand, also represent latencies, but they just weren't directly preceded by a blow. And then what we did was we added the range of intercall intervals on day one, what we're using as a control or type of control. And this is represented by the dotted orange lines. And we did this so that we could easily compare between day one and day two. And so what's really notable when you put both day one and day two data on the same graphic here is that there was a lot of variation in the latencies and Twain's calling behavior across the phases on day two, meaning there's a lot of variation in the height of these bars. But what's also really notable is that Twain's latencies on day two seem to be significantly reduced compared to the range produced on day one. So that is, the majority of these bars fall below this lower limit of the range of intercall intervals on day one. And just to visualize that another way, here's some violin plots that compare Twain's intercall intervals from all the phases on day two that are split out. And we compare them to the intercall intervals produced on day one. And so this graphic just shows a very similar picture to the previous one, that Twain seemed to have significantly reduced latencies on day two during the playback experiment compared to day one, our control. It's also notable that the latencies for phase one, which we labeled engagement, were significantly shorter compared to either phase two or phase three. And to ensure that our results were robust and not influenced by these phase definitions, we also tested whether all the latencies on day two were shorter than the latencies observed on day one. And indeed, that's what we found, that irrespective of phase, or with all of the phases combined, latencies were still significantly shorter on day two compared to day one. And finally, we wanted to test whether Twain had shorter latencies when engaged in a countercall exchange compared to what we considered not to be a countercall. And again, we found that countercall analysis, it was similar to the previous results, where Twain's latencies associated with countercalls were significantly lower than those were not considered countercalls. And so combined together, these results on intercall interval might indicate that Twain was modifying her vocalization rate based on the broadcast of the whoop exemplar.
Great, thanks, Josie. So a further question we considered in terms of the playback design was, could we temporally match Twain and in return have Twain temporally match us? And for this inquiry, it's important to note that the controller had full control over when she issued the exemplars. So we are actually measuring both our human temporal capacity as well as Twain's temporal capacity. But our overarching question was, did Twain respond to us in a temporally significant way? And the other question is, how might we understand the relationship between the exemplar timing and Twain's response timing? And so for this analysis, we focused solely on the phase one engagement and phase two agitation. We eliminated phase three disengagement as there was only one countercalling pair. And then we investigated techniques to better understand the relationship between exemplar timing and Twain's response timing. So we explored new ways of visualizing time values, whereby we explored viewing countercalling pairs as ratios based on intercall time intervals rather than understanding them in absolute time values. This gives us a sense of the relationship between our exemplar timing and Twain's response timing in each countercalling pair. So on the left of the slide is pair 7, countercalling pair 7, described in the timeline format, where exemplar 10 took place 12 seconds after the previous event of Twain's 7th response. And Twain's 8th response takes place 10 seconds after our exemplar number 10. This results in the countercalling pair of E10 and T8 taking a total of 22 seconds. When this data is placed in relationship and viewed in a ratio format or pie chart, as we see on the right, we can begin to read it right to left. The green on the right-hand side of the pie chart represents exemplar 10, and the blue on the left-hand side represents Twain's 8th response. Our 12 seconds represents 53% of the total 22 seconds, and Twain's response represents 47% of the total 22 seconds. This gives us a 53 to 47% ratio, or an almost near match between our timing and Twain's timing. We then classified the pair ratios as to their accuracy, with anything in the 40 to 50 percentile as a good temporal match, anything in the 60s, 30 percentile as an okay match, Anything in the 70-20 percentile as a poor match, and anything in the 80 percentile and above as no match. What our results show was that there was a total of 14 counter-calling pairs in the engagement phase, 9 of which were in the good matching classification, or 40 to 50 percentile. In the agitation phase, there was a total of 13 calling counter pairs, only 2 of which were in the good match classification, or in the 40 to 50 matching percentile. We then determined the percent of latency matching based on if there was a match solely in the 40 to 50 percentile criterion. This gave us an odds ratio of 9.9, which signifies that there was an almost 10 times greater time matching element in the engagement phase than in the agitation phase. So what is the significance of this time matching, and why should we care? This metric was analyzed because such matching represents a type of behavioral synchronization, which is known to be an important feature in human and non-human animal communication. And Twain's time matching suggests evidence of interest and engagement. It suggests she was actively listening, actively participating, actively matching the time values of the controller. It suggests that there was potential conversational intent in that she did not only respond to, but to temporally match the exemplars, as did the controller with respect to Twain's timings. And while we might think of a conversation in terms of linguistic elements and the framework of language, the degree to which Twain matched the exemplar timing and the continuation of the matching for over 6 to 7 minutes suggests she may have a sense of metricality, which is defined as equal intervals of time. And from a composer and whale song theorist perspective, for me, this is very interesting. Equal or even divisions of time is a key structure of human music and rhythmic patterning, and is visualized in Western musical notation as a grid structure produced by inserting bars or measures to denote equal buckets of time. This concept of metricality has also been evidenced in humpback song patterns by researchers such as Handel and Mercado, suggesting that temporal organization and coordination is not just salient, but important to the humpback whale. The question then becomes, how might we apply lessons from our human relationship to musical timing and tempo to better understand the humpback's unit of perception and relationship to sound? And I'm having great fun working with the Whale SETI team and Lawrence Doyle to further investigate the humpback's intricate song displays through the lens of human music. We are applying an information theoretical approach to determine whether even divisions of time might denote a shared or common structural component in both our species' system of communication. And we will be applying our insights to future playback designs.
Great. So briefly, I'm just going to summarize what we found with this Twain experiment. So first, what we've shown you is that Twain reduced her latencies throughout all phases of this dynamic communicative exchange on day 2 compared to day 1. And she also showed reduced latencies across the phases from first phase of engagement to the latter 2 phases. Twain also showed reduced latencies during counter calls compared to non-counter calls. And Twain also showed evidence of temporal matching in terms of both matching our criterion for a match or non-match, as well as the discrepancy or amount of temporal matching. And so altogether, these results might indicate that Twain was modifying her vocalization rate based on the broadcasted exemplar, and her motivational state might suggest arousal, valence, or combination. And after having witnessed this unique and dynamic type of exchange with Twain, we've come up with some future directions to expand our interactive playback design. First, we'd like to complement our current equipment setup and provide us with other tools that can better understand what's happening underneath the water during these exchanges. One limitation of the Twain studies, we didn't have these underwater cameras, so we could see when she surfaced or came to the surface and what was happening then, and we could also hear what she was doing, but we don't know about her orientation toward the boat. So that would be a nice addition. Next, we plan to lengthen the playback period to allow more opportunity for experimental probing of the system. In our previous design, we were limited to exactly to that 20 minutes. And so we had to stop at 20 minutes, which I think was kind of serendipitous because Twain was then continued vocalizing afterwards. But it would be nice in future field seasons to extend this playback time so that we have more flexibility. We'd also more systematically like to test the temporal aspect of this communication system. So during the exchange we had with Twain, the very temporal element was opportunistic or intuitive at best. And so since this is a relatively underexplored area of interactive playback design, we'd like to expand on this based on what we've learned so far with Twain. We'd also like to begin testing the potential functions of other social sounds. So as I mentioned before, humpbacks can have up to 40 different types of social calls, and we don't know a lot about how they function. So we'd like to kind of expand beyond the whoop and start to understand some of these other social sounds. But we'd still like to continue on our quest of understanding what this whoop call might mean. So in that aim, we'd like to perform alterations or mutations to these whoop calls to see how the behavioral or acoustic responses might change from the whales. So for example, could we find additional evidence for vocal matching if we, I don't know, shift the frequency of a whoop call and measure whether these targeted recipients then reiterate these frequency shifts or other types of mutations? And finally, we'd like to explore the natural sequences of humpback whale social sounds using these passive recordings to kind of measure the likelihood that certain sounds might follow other sounds. And then we can use this type of information in our interactive playbacks to test whether the targeted playback recipients or individuals could, quote unquote, finish our sentences based on the probability of expected sound outcomes. And this is where information theory could help us quantify some of these aspects of the likelihood of certain sounds following others in a sequence to provide structure to a string of signals. So now if we kind of circle back and think about these prereqs that I outlined earlier in the talk, I'd assert that we provided some evidence for the first two listed. So for number one, or the desire to communicate, we showed you how humpback whales will willingly initiate interactions with humans that are seemingly friendly and non-food motivated through mugging, spy hopping, and the production of bubble rings. Next, we demonstrated with this unique playback experiment that humpbacks can engage in turn taking with a playback stimulus, as measured by reduced intercall intervals, as well as increased temporal matching with the exemplar. And to communicate over long distances would likely favor this type of turn taking and active listening to try to avoid the overlap of signals or loss of information. But I might kind of encourage us in the discussion that's coming up to consider how or whether humpback whales might elicit some of these other traits that are listed here, such as shared understanding or goals, or even matching intelligence types. We have some broad ideas, I think, that we've brainstormed and prepped for this talk, but I'm also really curious to hear what the audience has to say. And finally, tying it back into our SETI goals, focusing on some of these conversation prereqs might provide us with insights into a well-known SETI phenomena called the Fermi paradox. And simply put, this is just the idea that there's ample evidence for interstellar intelligent life, but there's little evidence of detecting it throughout our universe. So the question remains, where is everybody? And if there is an abundance of life out there, why have we not detected it or had trouble doing that? One reason might be that we're only looking for specific types of signals, like narrow banded carrier waves. However, many signals in nature are actually broadband, and so using this type of approach, these types of signals would be missed. And so expanding our scope of search might be crucial for reaching our SETI goals. And using tools like information theory can help us create this type of communication intelligence filter by searching for structural patterns of signals that might require the least amount of effort by transmitting organisms. And I think this approach is particularly promising because this type of structure seems to be common of many human languages and has even been found in several non-human communication systems, such as songbirds and cetaceans. And although we may not know much about intelligent life in the universe just yet, we do have many unique and fascinating non-human intelligences right here on Earth, like the humpback whale, that might provide us with key clues about crossing this interspecies communication boundary. So understanding this boundary and focusing on these conversation prereqs might allow us to search for more broadband signals and point our radio telescopes in the right direction, so to speak, to better detect and interact with intelligent beings throughout the universe. And so with that, I'd like to thank our funding sources, which includes the Templeton World Foundation and the SETI Institute, as well as our collaborative partners, including Alaska Whale Foundation, Happy Whale, and the University of Southeast for providing advice on the project, as well as access to these long-term databases to identify whales. I'd also like to shout out to the Earth Species Project, who some of their members were able to accompany us on this voyage and provided their undivided attention and support for the observations that we reported here. And then last but not least, we'd really like to thank the Interspecies Internet Group for inviting us to present here today. And at this time, we'd be happy to take questions and start the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this really fascinating discussion and the presentation of your results from this recent research. I think this has been a very concrete example of the kind of work that is going on in the field. So this is really quite inspiring. I know a lot of your colleagues are here, so congratulations to all of you on this great research. We do have some questions already in the chat, and I'll also encourage anybody who would like to put their hand up, which is one of the functions of Zoom below. And Josie, do you want to just finish sharing and then sharing screen, and then that way we can get everybody up? Fantastic. Okay, so yeah, maybe we can start with Joe, who has his hand up there. Have their hand up.
Okay, hi, wonderful work. I'm really happy to see it. I should turn my video on so you can see my face, I guess. There. There's so much that I want to say, and I don't want to hog the time from everybody else, because I could talk to you guys for hours about this. I'm just curious, are you familiar with any of the non-scientific playback work that's been done over the decades, like specifically with Jim Nolman's work with playing jazz and blues for orcas in the 80s and the 90s?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Because that just made me think that playing back a sound that's one of their sounds, and this John Ford did that with orcas, and he had his small little rib almost rammed by the orcas because he played something that obviously they were not happy with hearing. But it's just kind of interesting that I'm wondering if you were talking about changing, varying the whoop call a little bit, but I'm just imagining Twain getting annoyed that, okay, you're saying the same damn thing over and over again. And Twain was probably, I don't know how much you examined the spectra of Twain's whoops, but I'm sure there was some variation in there, something subtle even that, you weren't getting. And so I'm just wondering if you're going to be doing that then in the future, are you looking at how Twain's responses changed, and can you use that as a way to modify your playback?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And that the point of Twain's potential frustration and us just eliciting the same call repetitively for 20 minutes has come up multiple times in our group, and trying to think about why you might expect an animal to continually respond or also get frustrated. It's like saying hello or some particular call 38 times. Right. So that's understandable. And I think it kind of coincides or nicely aligns with some of the behavioral data that we showed from the wheezy blows that might indicate that frustration. And then the second portion of your question, I can't remember.
Well, I was just kind of blabbing about using novel sounds, like playing music, actually, because that is, music is a form of communication, right? It's how it's a cohesive way of, it's a way of making a cohesive group.
I remember what I wanted to respond to based on what you said was the variation potentially in Twain's responses and how we might be able to analyze that. I think that kind of ties into some of our future directions of providing these underwater cameras, because the orientation of the animal to the speaker can affect the amplitude of that signal, and some of the ways that the hydrophones pick up those signals. So by adding those underwater cameras in future iterations, I think that we would better be able to get at or really measure that variation in signals by accounting for the orientation or distance of the whale to the hydrophone. But I think that would be really fascinating.
Right. And if I could just add one last thing, there's a guy named Peter Beamish who was he wrote a few books on rhythm-based time. Yes. And have you, Lisa, it looks like you're familiar with his work too, because when I finally, the last thing you did with your timing plots, I just thought, oh, this is what Peter was trying to convey to people for such a long time. But I mean, I think that it was hard for him to explain in his books, but and now it's hard for me to even talk about it.
No,
but it looks like
good.
you really kind of nailed that.
Yeah, Peter had very specific ideas about the temporal dimension. And
Yes.
what I found by working with the scientific team is we can take these intuitive ideas that we have as musicians, who of course I want to play music to the whales, but to try and scientifically analyze that afterwards is very difficult because we are dealing with so much information and so much intuitiveness. And so what I think we were able to do here is start to classify and understand the temporal dimension. How can we work with the temporal dimension? What are the innate tools that we have within our own perceptual systems that we can draw upon and apply to the study? And so I think we were blessed in that we only had the one whoop to play back. We had a very tightly contained experiment that highlighted the importance of the temporal. And I think as we go forwards, we're going to pull in studies from music. We're going to pull in Peter Beamish's work. We're going to look at Jim Noman's work. We're going to review all these wonderful experiments that have done before and apply those lessons.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thanks so much. It's really exciting work.
Thank you. Great questions.
We have a couple of questions. Thanks, Joe. We have a couple of questions in the chat as well. I don't know if anyone who wrote those would like to ask them to our speakers. We have one from Joy. Patty there. Mike. Yeah, Joy, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. It wasn't, first of all, I thought this was a very impressive study, and thank you for sharing it with us. I was unclear about whether or not the whoop sounds were played at a regular interval, or if the interval was somewhat random, or if you had some purposeful randomness in the timing. Because I think it looked like Twain was trying to put a response that was close to halfway in between each of those whoops. But yet each of those whoops didn't look like they were exactly timed at, I don't know, 20 seconds or whatever. So could you tell us more about what you chose for your timings of the whoops and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the beginning, because I was on the top deck, some of our other members were actually managing the playback stimuli, so they would know better. But my understanding is that in the beginning, we were broadcasting at random intervals because we had been, this wasn't our first playback that we had done during this season. I think it was maybe the 16th, if I'm remembering correctly. And all of our protocols were to broadcast at random intervals, as you would during a kind of a passive playback study. But once Twain started engaging with the stimuli, then the controller decided to start varying the temporal broadcast of the whoop exemplar. And so at that point, it kind of morphed into an interactive playback where the controller was then modifying when she would play back the exemplar based on when Twain would respond. And I think the idea for that was like even amounts of time once it became interactive.
Because it seems like this is just as much an experiment on how your person was pressing the button as much as it is on how the whale was responding. Because there's too much choice and uncontrolledness in that experiment if the person pressing the button is pressing at an interval that she or he thinks is an even interval and may not actually be because it's not being timed.
Yes. So we tested both the controller's temporal acuity as well as Twain's temporal acuity. And it's interesting to note that Brenda, who was the controller, has a dance background. And I find this fascinating because to understand how accurate we can be when we're measuring time, time is very difficult. If you take a stopwatch and try and measure 10 seconds, look at understand what 10 seconds is, then turn off your stopwatch and try and match 10 seconds. It's quite difficult. So yes, Brenda has a very, very good sense of timing, and I was impressed.
And just to add to that part, because of that reason that you'd expect that the amount of time between Twain's call and maybe the exemplar, because we're intentionally trying to kind of match that timing or see if she would match our timing. That's part of the reason why we only analyze the latencies between Twain's calls in those intercall interval results, was because of course you'd expect that the amount of time between us and Twain would be shorter because we're kind of interspersing between her calls. So to kind of test whether she was adjusting, we just looked at her calls during that time or during that playback portion.
But if you're just looking at her calls and not taking into account the variability of your calls, then you don't know if you have an effect on her call interval. So if you had Barbara, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the person who's pressing the button. If that person is pressing the button at 10 seconds the first time and 12 seconds the next time and 14 seconds the next time, did Twain's responses match that increase? If you don't take that into account, you don't know.
Yeah, I believe that's what Lisa was referring to, is that we did measure it both ways, and it did seem to indicate an interaction.
Yes, and I believe Brenda measured latencies both ways as well, from the exemplar to Twain and from Twain to the exemplar. Again, we were in the field, not a perfect study design. We didn't use a stopwatch, but the lessons that we learned from it, as you're saying, we were doing these on opportunistic intervals. Leave some questions to be further explored in next season, and maybe we have more defined intervals next time. Maybe we just try 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, or 5 seconds, things like that. But that's why I looked at the ratios to see, regardless of the absolute time values that we were dealing with, was there a proportional relationship between our exemplars and Twain's response, whether our timing was 10 seconds, 12 seconds, 17 seconds.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Diana, would you like to raise the next question?
Sure. Yeah, Joy, thanks for that comment. And I think that, with each, we all know that with each study, it brings up more questions when we look at the results. And I think I just want to commend these guys for doing a beautiful study. I think that we've gotten lots of really interesting information from this. I think also, I have a question. I just want to comment on one other thing that I think I also appreciated the fact that you were looking at other aspects of the whale's behavior, like the blows and trying to quantify the different types of blows. And also the bubble rings, I think, were quite interesting. And it brings up the question is, how do they function? Are they used perhaps to get attention because they've seen that it's gotten attention from others? It's quite interesting. It brings up a lot of really fascinating questions. I had a really simple question, and maybe I missed something in the beginning, but could you guys share how much we know about the timing of between these whoop calls of animals? Do we know much about that, about the timing they use amongst themselves with whoop calls, and anything that's known about that and concurrent behavior? I don't know that area of work.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my understanding is that part of the challenge of understanding how often they produce the whoop calls in terms of time is because in some cases, you might be recording these whoop calls in large aggregations, or in certain situations like feeding events where there might be a lot of chatter. So I think one thing is that it's variable across contexts. You might have some situations where they're producing whoop calls at faster or slower rates. And so in preparation or kind of analysis of these data, we went to the literature to try to figure out what is the common or average amount of time that humpbacks seem to elicit these whoop calls in between. And I didn't find a ton of information on that. And I think part of it is just parsing it out when you have a ton of whales, or even trying to localize those calls, in which case you'd need like an array of hydrophones. So what we tried to do to kind of address that was use this passive recording on the previous day as just a proxy for maybe how much time, without being probed by an experiment, these whales might produce these whoop calls in these scenarios.
So when you had, just to follow up on that, so when you went the first day of recordings where you were recording, how many animals were there approximately? I don't know how well you could see them, but there were several there.
There were 9 in that area for that 90-minute period, if I'm remembering correctly.
Mm-hmm. And we recorded 6 whoops over an hour and a half. Only 6. And the 6 whoops were at the very beginning of the recording, and they were about a minute in delay between each other. So it was like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over 6 minutes. And then it was silent. So the 9 whales only vocalized 6 times within that day 1 recording.
Well, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
when you have a group of 9 and you're not seeing the kind of temporal responses you got even with the playback of 1. I mean, this is pretty much a first study you guys did. That's very interesting in itself. Just
And
how distributed
just
they
to
were.
emphasize that, on day 2, when we did the playback, there were only 5 whales there throughout that entire time. So just to think about like density of whales and rate of vocalization for that whoop call, you might expect number of 9 whales to maybe produce more, but that might not be the case.
But when you did the playback of Twain's, I want to just be clear that this was the only whale that responded, right? Out of the 9 whales when you did the playback, right?
That's our understanding, because the amplitude or the intensity of the call was really strong. And Twain was the only whale that was really close to the vessel. There were a couple of other whales that were further away. And so we would expect that if they were coming from those other whales, that they might have some sort of attenuation or be a bit lower in amplitude.
Right. But the other point is that she was the only one that came close to the boat. Is Twain a male or female? It's a female?
Female.
Yeah, so she's the only animal that approached the boat in to that proximity, and it was her call that you were playing back.
It was either potentially her call or a familiar group mate. It's hard to say definitively, but what is curious is that she was the only one that was there on both days.
Yeah.
So she was kind of the common denominator across those 2 days, which makes it really fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that because I thought that's what you were saying. And I just didn't know if you had other information about in general, how often humpbacks respond to other calls and if they are, how they're responding and what the frequency is. But thank you. You did there. I didn't think there was much in the literature. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Again, great study. Thank you.
I just wanted to add that the basic understanding of whoop call interaction is that it isn't quite as dynamic as what we saw. It's very passive, sort of. I don't know if you guys are aware of chuck calls and squirrel monkeys, but it's kind of used as a way to sort of go back and forth and understand where animals are in the environment. So it's not normally that dynamic. But again, there's a lot to be learned about how these calls are used in the wild. It's still very unknown.
Would
Thanks,
it be okay?
Brad.
I pop up for a second and just add an additional comment. I just want to say Josie and Lisa did an outstanding job of explaining all of the information. But there was a previous comment about, was she getting irritated with this repetitive call? I think Joe made that comment, and that's certainly a possibility. But being able to judge where she was based on her blows, and we don't know where she went in between. She started out approaching the boat from the rear, from the stern on the port side or the left side, and then made her way closer to the hydrophone, and then passed it, and then backtracked again on that side of the boat, which makes the possibility that she was looking for the whale that was actually making point at which she had passed the hydrophone the first time and didn't actually find the whale, but heard a whale call, whether it was her call or one of her, group mates from the day before, is when the wheezy blows started and the bit of agitation sort of showed up. So, yeah, that was just an interesting additional part that we get cameras in the water, we'll be able to see where she is and if she's actually even approaching the hydrophone, and I say she, if we can get another whale who is as cooperative as Twain was. So thank you.
And Jody brings up a good point, is that we did these playbacks multiple times out in Southeast over the course of the week. And it was only Twain that we had this response to. So it was a very special event. a very special 20 minutes. And again, we'll be going back up there to get more data. But, you know, over the course of the week, I can't remember how many playbacks we did, but we had that one time with twin.
Yeah, I think it was a total of at least a little over 30, if I'm remembering correctly.
Kind
Right.
of demonstrated the Fermi paradox, wandering around Alaska saying hello and nobody says hello back, but we got one.
We got one.
Very exciting.
Awesome. Thank you for the inputs. This is great having all the inputs from the additional team members on the study. This is really great. Thank you. Con, let's go to your question. You're the next with your hand raised.
I found the bubble ring very interesting, and I was wondering if there is a possibility that it might be an intentional hello signal. I mean, I can see that it might be a purely emotional response carried over from the spiral of the feeding behavior, but I was wondering if you have any indications how often this bubble ring shows up, whether there's a lot of variation in it, either from a single whale varying the bubble ring or from different whales having different bubble rings and possible variations both among whales and between whales. Do you have any information on that?
That's a great question, and I'll do my best to describe it, but Jody is actually the person helping lead that manuscript. But to answer the question of does it happen across multiple whales? Yes. So this paper that we currently have under review to better understand the context of these like potentially friendly bubble rings, I think it includes somewhere between 7 and 10 different instances of whales that perform this behavior. Is that right, Jody?
Seven whales. And,
7 whales.
Yes, and I believe 9. I'm not good at keeping track of numbers in my head, but there were only 7 whales. And this was, we did outreach. We began this as a note on one whale that produced a series of bubble rings over a 12-15 minute period in 1988 as a 6-year-old, and then was never seen in that population again. And apparently, according to anecdotal evidence from several different people I've spoken to, there was bubble ring blowing at different times in that population, whether it was the same whale or whether it was another whale, we'll probably never know. But then people started coming to us with rings, and we did extensive outreach, and there were only 7 whales that we were able to find in 2 different populations. I've since spoken to people in the Southern Hemisphere, researchers down there, people who spend a lot of time on the water. They've never seen that. And we did actually contact several people using drones in their research, and over 3,000 hours of 1,100 drone deployments, there were no rings seen. So the only rings that have been observed have been adjacent to boats or in a couple of instances with swimmers in the water. So it appears that the whales are approaching people doing this. And if you have patience, we're going to get that paper published, and then there'll be a lot more information available on it. But yeah, it's very interesting. And so far it's not been in the, they haven't been feeding, well, shouldn't say that. Joy came up with a photo that showed some rings, and this was after, after late in the process. And we're still trying to talk to the photographer who got that in a bubble net. But all the other instances, there was no feeding going on, there was no aggression going on, and they seem to be coming up to the boats. And in my experience, spending a lot of time on boats with friendly behavior, like the mugging behavior that Josie mentioned, with whales approaching boats, they very often release a bubble blast, not a ring per se, but they come to the boat and then release a blast. And there's no research that's been done on that. So it's an open question.
And just to answer, I think address that second part of your question of variation produced in the bubble rings, I think that's some of what they go into in this paper is that you can have like a really good bubble ring that produces a nice spherical structure, but you could also imagine that that structure kind of degrades a bit. So they talk a little bit too about the ratings of bubble rings and quality of them produced.
Maybe I should add that a bubble ring isn't that easy to make. And we're looking into the idea of using the physics of the complexity of bubble ring, getting the poloidal motion correct, that there's a parameter space that the humpback has to know to make the ring stable. And if we can reverse engineer that, it's a way of implying the complexity of the mechanical ability, you might say, of a humpback whale.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead, Diana.
Oh, I just was going to add something. I think Brenda and I just want to mention Brenda and I had published on bubble rings in dolphins many years ago. And there was also a paper by Ken Martin, Lawrence, I'm just mentioning this to you guys, about looking at the physics of bubble ring production in bottlenose dolphins. You guys probably know that. It's quite interesting, but also just to give a little bit more insight, Karen Pryor and Ken Norris did a paper many years ago on bubble rings. They were the first, Karen Pryor, I think, was the first one to notice this. And they saw it in the nets, in the tuna nets where dolphins were being trapped when they were trying to capture tuna. And it may also be that one of the thoughts is that it may be when they're, I'm not suggesting this for the humpbacks, but it may be that the blowhole itself is constricted. It's under a situation where there's some kind of displacement behavior, because dolphins, like other even-toed ungulates that they're closely related to in whales, will release air when they're surprised. It's like often, and it may be a function of that kind of displacement behavior where it might first start and it creates a bubble ring. I think that's what Karen and Ken had suggested, rather than necessarily signaling. In captivity with dolphins, we saw it as play behavior. And the one thing I do want to note, based on what Josie was saying, is that, we saw that in some groups of dolphins, it didn't exist. We didn't see it. And then a dolphin from another group would come into another group. One would do it and it would spread through the group, and they do variations. So I think we have a lot to learn about bubble rings and how maybe it's something that's culturally disseminated, culturally learned, but it certainly is interesting. And going back to what Joy Reidenberg was saying, I think so many of these things when we're interacting with these animals have a transactional aspect to it. When animals learn what the contingencies are, they may do bubble rings at a point because it gets attention, and then that may have a function in itself. So I just wanted to throw those ideas back out again. Anyway, just thought.
Thank you.
If I can add one little additional piece, Lawrence says rightly that it is difficult to blow rings. And it's interesting what you said, Diana, about the dolphins under stress. And as I'm sure most people, if not everybody in this group, know, that dolphins have a single blowhole, humpback whales have a double blowhole. And so it requires much more sophistication to be able to close off one, release air from the other nostril to be able to do these rings. But also have a friend who is very competent at blowing bubble rings. And she's done demonstrations for us where she doesn't get them right every time. It's like everything else. It takes some practice, and you have to release the air in such a way. And, she gave us a demonstration without on board of, moving her head back, jerking this whole thing. So we're still, working with Joy on trying to understand exactly how it is that humpback whales are even capable of doing this in the first place. But it's a strategy, and in the situations where the observations that we've gathered, the whales did not appear to be under stress at all. And so it seems that play is the most likely, or a communicative attempt is the most likely reason.
Wonderful, thanks for that. And also we have Fabienne has pasted a study or a paper in the chat. So if anybody's interested in following up on that, I think that's a really great additional bit of info on the bubble rings discussion. So I want to encourage anyone else who has a final question to pose it now. If you would like to ask our speakers today anything else.
I just see a note from Joe Olson regarding the Lubell speaker and the idea that the playback would even if it was Twain's voice, it wouldn't sound the same. And this actually ended up working in our favor because we processed the whoop call a bit. And if it was Twain's voice, if we had a perfect match, it would have been really hard in our analysis to tell which one was Twain and which one was the speaker. And it worked in our favor because it actually had a more electronic sound. So it'd be like us listening to our voice through a telephone or something like that. So you could still you might be able to tell us your voice, but it's some way altered. So again, maybe in future playback studies, we need to do a little ping or something as we perfect how to take a recording of a whoop call and mirror it back.
Exactly, Joy. Auto-tuned, yeah. Oh, and I just had one other thing. I mean, this is SETI, right? I mean, we got to kind of connect it even more. And I just wondered, have you seen any cloaked Klingon birds of prey nearby, like hovering over?
Evidence of the invisibility cloak.
Yeah, right. What is that? Evidence of absence is not, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Yeah. Well, the Fermi paradox continues, but we haven't looked through very much of the galaxies, so we're not all discouraged or anything like that either.
Right.
This will help because so far SETI consists of narrow carrier waves, and not everyone transmits with a narrow radio station, and nature can't make anything narrower than 300 hertz. And so in some sense, the idea that we should look at the message, that's the stuff we're helping to develop for SETI, so we can fundamentally change. Instead just asking the question, is there a transmitter? We can ask the question, is that an intelligent signal?
Yeah, that's wonderful. You know, I attend these weekly astrobiology colloquia at the University of Washington, and I think this talk could be really interesting for the group. If you guys are interested, I might suggest it to them. Typically, it's right. More, geophysics, or physical oceanography, microbiology, not big macrobiology and communication, but I think that's an important part that would be kind of fun for the group to see.
Yeah, the right side of the Drake equation is unexplored territory.
Yeah.
I think let's go to the final question that Darcy has just put into the chat, and then I think we can start wrapping it up. I don't know if you would like to ask that, Darcy, or I can read it out. So I might just read this. So if you use Twain's call and it was modified, do you think that the others didn't respond because of this? Is it possible to use a call from a different group?
Oh, is it possible that we used a call from a different group? And I think we don't have that 100% stat that says this was Twain's call, but on day one, when we had, just to remind me, was it nine whales in the group versus day two, we had, I think it was 6 whales. The vocalization that we recorded on day one, Twain was photographed close to the boat at that time, and the whoop is very clear. We only modified it in terms of trying to adjust a slight adjustment of frequencies to make sure that the speaker didn't affect the frequencies of the broadcast. On day two, Twain was at the boat before we started the playback. Again, this was a very serendipitous event. She had head lunged towards the boat. The other whales, they were probably 1 kilometer away in distance. So we might have some evidence there that the whoop calls function as a near field call. Again, the study just raised way more questions than we were able to answer with this data set, but we will take all those lessons going forwards And if we do try the mirror experiment again, try and get more data on the underwater positioning of the whales when we collect the samples.
I'll just
If
add to that. Oh,
Josie.
I'll just add to that up until the 16th playback where we had this exchange with Twain, we were using previous calls from previous field experiments that were recorded by, I believe they were banked by Fred, one of our team members. So the stimuli that we were using in prior experiments up until this point were from other groups, or I believe it was the same population, but just at other time points. And we weren't getting any sort of responses from that. And so I think it was kind of opportunistic that we had this passive recording, got a really high quality whoop call, and Brenda was like, let's use this because it seems maybe it'll be more salient. And I think clearly for whatever reason it was, and then we had this exchange. So we did try that. And I think that's what makes this interaction different from the other playbacks that we had.
Kate, can I just say one? I know we're to the last end. I just, as one of the founders of Interspecies Internet, I just have to congratulate you guys for this beautiful piece of work, because I just want to remind us all, I mean, I think we all know this, but we are in the infancy of interspecies communication studies. We really are. And I think these kinds of studies, you know, we learn so much from each one of these, and there's been so little done so far where anybody's gotten positive responses to playback. I mean, we tried playback years ago, you know, with different animals. The humpbacks often will not respond. I know we had a stranded whale in San Francisco, and they tried to play orca sounds and there was no response. So these are, we did some successful playback getting a humpback to follow us playing feeding sounds, but it's rare. So I just want to say congrats to you guys. I think you have an amazing team. I think we're all looking forward to hearing more about this. And I just wanted to thank you all for presenting today. It was very exciting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Yeah.
This has been really fascinating, and thank you to all of the team members and the group who came on board to give their additional thoughts and inputs. This has been fascinating, and I think, you know, it's really showing the dynamism of this this very mixed group of people coming together in pursuit of these kinds of aims through the research you're doing. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate it. And if everybody keeps an eye on their email inbox, you will see what our next lecture will be on, which we will have coming up in May. And until then, I hope you have a very lovely weekend. And everybody who got up very early can now enjoy a nice coffee and a good weekend. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.